History remembers one year by a haunting name, the year without a summer. In 1816, people across the world found themselves asking the same frightening question. What happened to summer? The warm season they had always depended on simply never arrived. Farmers watched in disbelief as healthy crops, which had taken months of hard work to grow, were wiped out almost overnight. Rivers, lakes, and streams that should have been flowing under the summer sun froze into ice, and even during the day, an eerie darkness seemed to hang over the land. Terrified, people searched the skies for answers. They watched the strange weather unfold with growing fear, believing the mystery had to be somewhere above them. But the true cause of this disaster wasn't in the sky at all. It was thousands of miles away, hidden deep beneath the earth. We're uncovering the incredible true story of how a single mountain changed the weather of the entire world. On the Indonesian island of Sumbawa stood a breathtaking volcano known as Mount Tambura. Rising nearly 4,300 meters into the sky, it was the tallest peak in the region at the time, with its summit often disappearing into the clouds. For centuries, Tambura had remained silent, almost as if it were asleep. Villages on the surrounding islands thrived peacefully. Families farmed their land, fishermen brought in fresh catches from the sea, and life continued as it always had. But beneath that peaceful mountain, something terrifying was happening. Deep underground, an enormous chamber of molten rock was slowly filling with pressure. Year after year, a vast ocean of magma continued to rise, storing enough energy to unleash one of the greatest natural disasters in human history. The people living nearby had no idea that every passing day was bringing them closer to unimaginable destruction. Then came April 10th, 1815. After centuries of silence, Mount Tambura finally awakened. This wasn't an ordinary volcanic eruption. According to scientists, it remains one of the most powerful eruptions of the last 10,000 years. The explosion was so unimaginably violent that its sound traveled for thousands of miles. People living nearly 2,600 kilometers away heard what sounded like massive cannon fire echoing across the horizon. Many believed a major war had broken out nearby. British military officers even ordered their artillery units to prepare for battle, convinced that enemy ships or pirates had launched an attack. No one realized they were actually hearing the roar of a volcano. Then, without warning, daylight vanished. The sky turned completely black as enormous clouds of ash covered the sun. Burning rocks rained down from above, while rivers of blazing gas and volcanic debris raced down the mountainside at incredible speeds. These deadly avalanches, known as pyroclastic flows, reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius and moved at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Nothing could survive in their path. Entire villages in the kingdom of Tambura were erased within moments. Homes, forests, animals, and thousands of people disappeared beneath an unstoppable wall of fire and ash. There wasn't even enough time to run, let alone escape. As if that weren't enough, the sheer force of the eruption caused massive sections of the volcano to collapse into itself, triggering enormous tsunamis that swept across nearby coastlines. Whole settlements were swallowed by the sea as towering waves crashed ashore, leaving devastation wherever they struck. When the ash finally settled days later, survivors could hardly believe what they were seeing. The towering summit of Mount Tambura had vanished. In its place was an enormous caldera, a gigantic crater nearly 6 kilometers wide and about 1 kilometer deep. A mountain that had once dominated the skyline had literally blown itself apart. Most people think lava is the deadliest part of a volcanic eruption. But in the case of Mount Tambura, lava wasn't the real killer. The greatest danger was something far more invisible and far more devastating. When most people picture a volcanic eruption, they imagine rivers of glowing lava destroying everything in their path. But strangely enough, lava wasn't what changed the world after Mount Tambura erupted. The real threat never stayed on the ground. It rose high into the atmosphere. According to scientists at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the eruption blasted an enormous cloud of volcanic ash, smoke, and millions of tons of sulfur dioxide gas into the upper atmosphere. Instead of remaining close to the Earth's surface, these gases climbed all the way into the stratosphere, a layer of the atmosphere that stretches roughly 50 kilometers above the ground. That detail changed everything. Unlike the lower atmosphere, where storms and winds constantly mix the air, the stratosphere is remarkably stable. Anything that reaches that altitude can remain there for a long time. Once Tambura's sulfur dioxide entered the stratosphere, it didn't simply disappear. Powerful air currents carried it across vast distances until it spread over much of the northern hemisphere. Soon, the gas began reacting with tiny droplets of water suspended in the atmosphere. That chemical reaction produced microscopic particles known as sulfate aerosols. Although each particle was incredibly small, together they formed an enormous invisible veil around the planet. But it was silently changing the Earth's climate. Instead of allowing the sun's energy to pass through the atmosphere as usual, this massive layer of aerosols reflected a significant portion of that sunlight back into space. Less sunlight reached the Earth's surface, which meant less heat reached the land and oceans. As the weeks passed, global temperatures began to fall. History would forever remember 1816 as the year without a summer. Across North America and Europe, the seasons seemed to stop making sense. June arrived, but the warmth never followed. In parts of New England, Canada, and the northeastern United States, snow fell during the middle of July. People woke to frozen fields that should have been filled with growing crops. Frost covered farmland during what was supposed to be the peak of summer. Temperatures dropped so dramatically that in some places they reached freezing levels when families should have been harvesting food. Families watched months of hard work disappear in only a few nights. With little firewood left after winter, many people were forced to light fires inside their homes throughout the summer just to stay warm. Disease followed malnutrition, and thousands of people found themselves fighting simply to stay alive. What had started as a volcanic eruption on a distant Indonesian island had now become a worldwide humanitarian disaster, and the worst was still yet to come. By the summer of 1816, the effects of Tambura's eruption had reached nearly every corner of the northern hemisphere. Today, when an earthquake strikes or the weather suddenly changes, news spreads across the globe within minutes. A notification appears on our phones, dates, and scientists quickly explain what's happening. But in 1816, none of that existed. People in Europe and North America could see the strange weather with their own eyes. But they had absolutely no idea that the true cause lay thousands of miles away, on a volcanic island in Indonesia. Without answers, fear quickly filled the void. Some believed the world was approaching the apocalypse. Others were convinced the sun was slowly losing its power. People went to bed each night wondering whether the next day would bring even more suffering. Meanwhile, the harvests continued to fail. Fields that normally produced enough food to feed entire communities now yielded almost nothing. The food supply began shrinking at an alarming rate. Whenever supply falls while demand keeps rising, prices inevitably follow. Within months, the cost of basic food skyrocketed beyond what ordinary families could afford. When Mount Tambura exploded, the immense pressure beneath the volcano launched millions of tons of sulfur dioxide gas high into the stratosphere. Once there, the gas mixed with tiny droplets of water naturally present in the atmosphere. That chemical reaction created countless microscopic particles called sulfate aerosols. Imagine wrapping the entire Earth in a giant invisible mirror. As sunlight traveled toward the planet, this layer reflected a significant portion of that energy back into space before it could warm the surface below. It was as though someone had turned the Earth's air conditioning to its highest setting, and then thrown away the remote. The cooling wasn't permanent. By 1817, the weather had started showing small signs of improvement. Even so, the damage left behind was enormous, and recovery would take years. Throughout 1818 and 1819, growing seasons slowly returned to normal across much of the world. Fields that had remained barren began producing crops once again. Farms turned green, harvests improved.
According to scientists, by around 1820, roughly 5 years after the eruption, the Earth's temperatures had largely recovered, and the climate had stabilized once again. But that raises an unsettling question. If an eruption like Tambura's happened today, would our modern world really be any better prepared?